And now, from the CFTK-TV studios, this is Open Connection with your host, Robert Pictou.
Welcome to Open Connection. I'm your host, Robert Pictou. A May 27th press release by the Kamloops Secwepemc First Nations stated the use of ground-penetrating radar confirms an unthinkable loss that was spoken about but never documented. And it says preliminary findings show the confirmation of the remains of 215 students. On today's Open Connection, MP Taylor Bachrach shares his reaction.
The discovery of 215 unmarked burial sites at the former residential school just outside Kamloops. And I've just been hearing from so many people, especially Indigenous folks across the Northwest, for whom this brought up so many bad memories and the trauma that they've been through and their families have been through. It's something that as a region and as a province, it's going to take a long time to process. And there's a lot of sadness, there's a lot of grief out there, but there's also a frustration, Robert, a frustration that there's been so little progress over the past 6 years since the Truth and Reconciliation Commission released its 94 calls to action. And that's something I've heard overwhelmingly, is that they want the federal government to act immediately, to take action, especially on the calls to action related to searching the other residential school sites across Canada and trying to locate all of the missing children. We know that there are more, that this discovery near Kamloops is just the beginning of what is going to be some really difficult truth, not just for Indigenous people, but for our whole country. So they've called for that action. That's something that I'm echoing as Member of Parliament, and it's something that our party and our leader, Jagmeet Singh, has been pushing so hard for the last couple of weeks. You might have heard about the motion that we brought forward in Parliament immediately following the discovery near Kamloops, calling on the government to take immediate action on reconciliation. And there were a few things that we're pushing for, we're fighting for in Ottawa. The first one is that the government needs to immediately implement calls to action 71 through 78. And those relate specifically to the investigation into missing children at residential schools. So the progress on that has been far too slow, and we need some marked progress right away to go out there and work with communities, provide them the resources, conduct these searches, and find the remaining missing children. So that's the first thing. But the other thing is that tragically, the federal government is still fighting Indigenous kids in court. There was a recent Human Rights Tribunal ruling that found that Canada's treatment of Indigenous kids in care through the child welfare system has been discriminatory, that Indigenous kids are being taken away from their families at a greater rate than non-Indigenous kids, and that this is causing real harm. And, inexplicably, the federal government appealed that ruling. They went to court and are essentially fighting against Indigenous kids receiving the compensation, their families receiving the compensation that they're due. So our motion called for the government to call off not just that court case, but also their court case involving the survivors of the St. Anne's residential school in Ontario. So these are things that incredible people like Cindy Blackstock have been fighting tooth and nail to get justice for Indigenous kids. And we want to have their backs in Ottawa. So that was the gist of our motion. We also want to see the federal government provide adequate support for residential school survivors for the healing process. And we were pleased to see this motion supported unanimously in Parliament. But Robert, the Prime Minister and the Prime Minister's cabinet didn't have the courage to attend the vote and to vote on that motion. They abstained from the vote. And I think Canadians, especially Indigenous people, deserve an explanation why that is. But when it comes to the actual actions, when it comes to justice, when it comes to implementing the calls to action, we see very, very little. And so we're pushing to call out that disconnect between the words and the action, and to make sure the federal government is doing right by Indigenous people by implementing these calls to action. This is a roadmap for reconciliation. And the reality is that we have implemented so few of those calls to action. And the ones that we have implemented, many of them are more symbolic than substantive. There need to be real changes, systemic changes to our justice system, to our education system, to so many of the ways in which we function as a country. And on many fronts, that work is only now just beginning. We need to see a much more concerted approach.
Open Connection will be right back after these messages. And now, from the CFTK-TV studios, this is Open Connection with your host, Robert Pictou.
Thanks for staying with us. According to a recent survey commissioned by the Canada Race Relation Foundation and the Assembly of First Nations, before the remains of 215 Indigenous children were found in Kamloops, 2/3 of Canadians say they knew little or nothing about the history of this country's residential school system. Let us return to the conversation as MP Bachrach shares about a recent gathering at Bachrach Residential School.
Folks in the Northwest will be aware of the Bachrach Residential School. It was a place where many families' kids were taken to, and it caused an incredible amount of trauma for people here in the Northwest. It was in operation for decades and decades. And immediately following the news out of Kamloops, people started organizing and going on social media and pulling together and supporting each other. And they organized an event at Bachrach, as you said. And one of my friends told me she was going, so I hopped in the vehicle and headed out there. And it was an incredibly powerful day, seeing the strength and the resilience and the courage of people, many of them either residential school survivors or people from families who've been profoundly affected by the residential school legacy, coming together and sharing their grief, supporting each other, and talking about what this means, and doing so on the site of the school. The school is now gone; it's been demolished, but that piece of ground holds so much significance for people. There's so many memories tied up there, and it was a powerful day to be witness to. I know that there's another ceremony coming up, a healing ceremony that's going to take place, I believe, next month at Bachrach, and I'm hopeful that out of that people can find some support and the help that they need in community to deal with all of the stuff that this recent discovery is bringing up. Unfortunately, when the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was in Smithers itself, I was out of town on a work trip, but I was actually in Winnipeg during the time at which the Truth and Reconciliation Commission released its final report. And shortly thereafter, I was in Ottawa and certainly watched the media very closely, hearing the stories of the survivors and reflecting on the importance of that moment. It was really heralded as something significant because the commission had heard all of these stories across the country and collected all of this truth and put together these 94 calls to action. There was a lot of hope that we would see action from our government, that we would see something really significant and meaningful. And, as often happens with the federal government, we haven't seen the follow through. We haven't seen the really fundamental changes that are needed to ensure, first of all, that the survivors get the support that they need, and that the rest of the population really understands what went on and how residential schools worked as a part of Canadian government policy. That these were not schools in any sense of the word that we would understand when we think of education today. These were horrible places where incredible atrocities were committed. And so many Canadians still don't understand the depth of that. It's starting to, I think with the recent news, there are many people who are starting to really begin to understand what this really meant. And we have so much work left to do, Robert, as you know very well. We're just beginning down that path And we need to redouble our efforts more than ever now, and make sure that we do right by the families, by the survivors, and by all Indigenous people across Canada. Well, those calls to action relate specifically to investigations into missing children from residential schools. Truth and reconciliation is, first of all, about truth. And we still don't know the entire truth when it comes to what happened at residential schools. And most importantly, we don't know who the children are that went missing and whose lives were taken. And that's such an important part. I think families that I talk to want closure. They want to know what happened. They want to know if these missing children are connected to them. So many families lost members of their family and never knew what happened to them. Shamefully, the Catholic Church still hasn't released the records of what happened at these schools. And that's an important part of this story as well. That's starting to, I think the pressure on the church is starting to really grow. And that's good to see, because frankly, the church hasn't been accountable. They haven't owned up to their role in this horrible, I know chapter in our history is the wrong word, because in so many ways, the residential school legacy continues today, but they haven't owned up to what happened. And that has to take place.
Open Connection will be right back after these messages. And now, from the CFTK-TV studios, this is Open Connection with your host, Robert Pictou.
Welcome back to Open Connection. Ramona Wilson was just 16 years old when she went missing on June 1994. Her remains were found 10 minutes later near the Smithers Airport. Let us return to the conversation as MP Bachrach shares about his thoughts on the annual Ramona Wilson Memorial Walk.
Just yesterday, we took part in the Ramona Wilson Memorial Walk. This year it was a drive, but for 27 years, her family has come together with the community to remember Ramona and to push for change and support all the families that have had their loved ones go missing along our highway and throughout our region. The reason I brought forward Ramona's story and the connection to the discovery in Kamloops is that in both cases, families want to know what happened. They want that closure. They want that understanding of what happened to their loved ones. And in the case of the discovery at Kamloops, families want the other sites searched. They want to know which children went missing, and they want to know if they're connected to them, if it was their family members. In the case of Ramona's family, her sister Brenda and her mom Matilda, they want to know what happened to Ramona. They want to know who did it. They want justice and they want closure. Even 27 years later, they keep that call alive. And yesterday at the gathering here in Smithers, we heard from the RCMP that have been investigating it for decades. And they continue to try to find leads and to try to find out what happened. And I've just been so touched listening to her family and reflecting on the depth of love and commitment that they've shown all these years in her memory. It's really profound. So I think that's understandable for anyone who's had a loved one go missing and hasn't known what's happened. It's that sense of closure that's so important to people. So that's why I mentioned the Wilson family in my speech. The other story I mentioned in my speech, Robert, was the story of Lower Post. And I don't know if we've spoken about that before, but 2 winters ago, I had a chance to travel up to Lower Post, which is a tiny community up by Watson Lake. It's just on the BC side of the BC-Yukon border. And Lower Post was the site of a residential school as well, where kids from all across the Yukon and Northwest BC were taken. And, the residential school building still stands today. And since the 1970s, the community of Deludene have had to use that building as their band office. And they've been calling for years and years, calling on the federal government to tear this building down and to replace it with a new community building, because elders in the community who were traumatized at that residential school have been forced to walk through the doors to access basic services for years and years. And it's just completely unacceptable. So I was really moved by the story, and the deputy chief from the community took me on a tour. He talked to me about how significant it was going to be for them to tear down that building. And on the 21st, I'm going to be traveling to Lower Post. I know the premier is going to be there as well, and they're going to be having a ceremony to mark the demolition at long last of that residential school. And it's going to be replaced with a new building. So that was another story that I mentioned in my remarks in the House. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission approached the federal government and said, we want to conduct searches of the other residential school sites, and we want $1.5 million to fund that important work. And the federal government at the time, under Stephen Harper, declined that request. And I think in light of the news coming out of Kamloops, it's just so shameful and surprising, frankly, that the government wouldn't, I know to some people $1.5 million seems like a lot of money, but in the context of the federal budget, that's a pretty modest amount. And what I was thinking, and what I reflected on it in my remarks, is if that work had taken place, how many families would get the truth about their loved ones, and how many elders who have since passed on would have more information about what happened. I think we can't go back in time, but that was a mistake, and we need to acknowledge that, and we need to do better as we move forward.
Open Connection will be right back after these messages. And now, from the CFTK-TV studios, this is Open Connection with your host, Robert Pictou.
Recently, London police stated they're considering laying terrorism charges against a man accused of killing members of a Muslim family out on a walk in London, Ontario on Sunday because of their faith. In this final segment of Open Connection, MP Bachrach shares his reaction.
Hearing that news out of London, and Jagmeet took part in the vigil afterwards, and spoke in the House very movingly about Islamophobia and the impact it has on our country. It's something that we have to do much more on. You and I have spoken on your show before about the rise of hate in Canada and the impact that has on people, particularly people of color in our country. And we've seen political parties and political leaders intentionally sow the seeds of division and fan the flames of hate against Muslims, Islamophobia, and it's completely unacceptable. And you can draw a straight line between that kind of speech, those kinds of actions, and the tragic event that happened in London, where a family was out for a walk, and they were the victims of a targeted hate crime, a vehicle attack that took 4 of their lives and left their little boy in the hospital. So it's I don't know how to really give it words, but it's making a lot of people reflect on the fact that is a part of our country, and it's something that we need to do much more to address, to bring it out in the open, and to proactively put laws in place, and to, as a community, say that this is unacceptable.
As a country, we need to do is reconciliation. We hear the words, and a lot of times we're kind of pointing fingers at each other, First Nation or Indigenous people to elected officials, to other groups, to hate groups. What do you think? Where can we actually start reconciliation?
When we talk about the TRC, it's truth and reconciliation. And in many ways, we're still at the truth phase. For so many Canadians, they're still starting to grapple with the reality that Indigenous people have faced in our country since it was formed. And that's a picture with a lot of dark parts. And I think we have a lot of work left to do still to help people understand the depth of that. When it comes to the reconciliation part, I know that for some Indigenous folks that I've heard from, they struggle with the phrase. They feel like it's been misused, that it's become a cliche, it's become political jargon. And that, at the heart of it is the concept of justice, that we need justice for Indigenous people. We need to resolve in a good way questions like rights and title to the land. And we need to do better on the issues that we've been talking about today, on the legacy of residential schools, on these court cases involving Indigenous kids. And I hear from people who just don't feel like the government takes it seriously enough. Now, the question you asked was about whether reconciliation can start at home, and I really believe it can. It has its heart in the relationships between neighbors, between you and I, and between people in our region. I remember the judge in the landmark Delgamuukw court case. In his final ruling, there was a famous phrase that we are all here to stay. And I think it really behooves those of us who want to see our families living in the Northwest in the future, and maybe for generations to come, to do the hard work of understanding the history and understanding the aspirations of Indigenous people. And sometimes it's going to be a difficult path, but if we can invest in those relationships and if we can seek understanding, I'm hopeful that we can make some progress. In these last couple of weeks, there's a real push to deal with the legislation that the House has been working on for the past number of months. There are long sittings. We're considering a motion today to extend the sittings until midnight to try to get some of this parliamentary business done. So this is really crunch time for this Parliament. And it seems like the Liberals want an election. The Prime Minister's itching for an election. So a lot rides on these final weeks. We're working on some important legislation, trying to ensure that it gets through not just the House, but the Senate. We've seen so many important bills in past parliaments not make it into law because they essentially timed out and they died in the Senate. So we're dealing with some important legislation this week around climate accountability. That's an issue that I've been working on. There are also other important bills like C-15, which is the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. So we're going to be working hard this last bit. I also have, this week, we have the hearings into rail safety are happening, parliamentary hearings into an issue that affects a lot of people here in the Northwest and a lot of communities. So we're looking forward to hearing from the witnesses and hopefully shedding some light on what needs to be done to make our community safer.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Open Connection. The greatest distance in the existence of man is not from here to there, but the connection from his mind to his heart. If we can conquer that distance, we can soar like an eagle and realize our immensity within. I'm Robert Pictou.